Welcome to Dictarine of Darkness, a place where silenced voices breathe again through the echoes of history. Before we proceed, drop a comment and let me know, where are you watching from? Your city, your country, and what time is it there right now? And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because here we unearth the stories the world tried to erase. Now listen closely, because tonight you'll encounter a man no one could sell. They first noticed him in the fog of early morning in 1847. Standing alone at the edge of a dirt path just beyond the New Orleans slave market, a place where human lives were weighed, priced and discarded without mercy. At first, nobody believed what their eyes were telling them, because the silhouette in the distance didn't resemble a man. He appeared like something carved from the earth itself, something ancient, something deeply wrong. He towered over any man they had ever seen, his head rising well above the wooden fence posts, as if the fence had been constructed for children. The trader who first spotted him was a man named Edmund Briggs, who had spent 23 years dealing in the buying and selling of human beings. A man who believed he had witnessed every horror slavery could generate. But when Briggs halted his stride and stared across the dusty road, he felt something unfamiliar stir within him, something cold, fear. The giant remained motionless. He offered no words. His arms hung at his sides, long and heavy, the muscles visible even from a distance. His shoulders were so broad they seemed unnatural. His chest rose and fell slowly like the gradual swell of the tide before a storm. A group of enslaved men standing nearby noticed Briggs staring and followed his gaze. One of them muttered something under his breath. Another stepped backward. No one laughed. No one spoke above a whisper, because every man there understood one truth without needing to voice it. This man was different. Briggs began walking toward him slowly, carefully, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The closer he drew, the more impossible the man became. He wasn't merely tall, he was colossal. His hands alone were the size of shovels, his fingers thick and scarred, his neck as wide as another man's thigh. And yet his face was composed, vacant, and utterly silent. Briggs stopped a few feet away and looked up. He had to look up. Never before had he needed to look up at an enslaved man. Not like this, not ever. The giant's eyes met his, dark, steady, and completely devoid of fear. That was the first thing Briggs noticed, no fear. Every enslaved person he had ever encountered carried fear somewhere, in their expression, in their eyes, in the tension of their frame. But not this man. This man stood like a tree that had never known the wind. Briggs cleared his throat. He tried to summon authority, but his voice came out thinner than he intended. "What is your name?" The giant offered no reply. He simply stared. Briggs felt irritation rising within him. He wasn't accustomed to being disregarded. He stepped nearer. "I asked you your name." Still nothing. One of the other traders approached from behind, a shorter man named Calvin Harov, notorious for his brutal temper. Harov laughed when he laid eyes on the giant and circled him like a piece of livestock, examining him. He struck the giant's arm hard. The sound echoed like wood being struck. "Strong," Harov said. "Very strong." But strength alone was worthless if it couldn't be controlled. Harov grabbed the giant's chin and tried to force his face upward. The giant didn't resist, but neither did he assist. He remained motionless, unyielding as stone. Harov frowned. Something about that stillness unsettled him. "Released he come from?" Harov asked Briggs. Briggs shook his head slowly. "I don't know." That was the truth. No one knew. The giant had arrived with a shipment from Virginia, but none of the documentation mentioned him. No record, no name, no listed price. It was as if he had materialized from nowhere, and that was a problem because in the world of slavery, every human being was meant to be reduced to numbers: age, weight, strength, price. But this man refused to fit into any of those categories. A crowd began to gather. Buyers, traders, curious onlookers. They murmured among themselves. Some laughed nervously. Others stared in silence. One plantation owner, a heavy man named Thomas Whitaker, stepped forward. Whitaker had built his fortune on sugar, and sugar required strength, endless strength. He approached the giant and studied him carefully. He reached out and pressed his hand against the giant's chest, as if testing whether he was real. The chest didn't move. Whitaker smiled slowly. "This one," he said, "will fetch a high price." But even as he spoke those words, something in his voice betrayed uncertainty. Because deep down, Whitaker understood something the others hadn't yet grasped. Owning a man this immense wasn't the same as owning other men. This wasn't simply property. This was something else, something unpredictable, something that couldn't be easily transported, easily beaten, or easily controlled. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. The giant remained where he stood, silent, patient, watching, waiting, and though none of them realized it yet, this man would soon become the most feared, most discussed, and most impossible slave the market had ever witnessed. Not because he refused to work, not because he fought back, but because no master could move him, and no chain could truly hold him. The first chain they brought was the heaviest in the yard, a thick iron length, usually reserved for men who had already attempted escape and failed. Men whose bodies bore the scars of punishment and whose spirits had been crushed into submission. But even the trader who carried it, a narrow-faced man named Silas Monroe, hesitated as he approached the giant, because up close, the size of the man distorted the mind, making normal judgment feel small and unreliable, making every instinct whisper caution, and yet Monroe had built his reputation on control. He had chained hundreds of men, he had broken hundreds more. He would not allow doubt to take root within him now. So he stepped forward and wrapped the iron around the giant's left wrist. The metal barely fit, the cuff pressing tight against skin that felt more like carved wood than flesh. And still the giant didn't move, didn't resist, didn't even look down. He simply stood as he had stood since morning, breathing slowly, watching everything with those silent, steady eyes that revealed nothing and forgave nothing. Monroe fastened the lock with a loud click, a sound that usually signaled victory, but today it rang thin and uncertain like a lie spoken too quickly. When Monroe stepped back, the chain hung from the giant's wrist like a loose rope tied to a monument. The crowd leaned forward, curious, uneasy, waiting to see what would happen next. Because the market had rules, and one of those rules was simple. Every new slave must be tested. Every body must prove it could be controlled, must prove it could be moved, must prove it could serve. So Monroe gestured to two other handlers, men named Jonas Pike and Robert Clean, both experienced, both confident, both unaware they were about to fail in a way no one present would ever forget. Together they took hold of the chain and pulled, not violently at first, but firmly the way one pulls a stubborn mule, expecting resistance, expecting struggle, expecting the familiar rhythm of dominance and submission. But the giant didn't resist, and that was the strangest part. He didn't pull back, he didn't brace himself, he didn't tense, he simply remained, and yet, he didn't move forward either. Pike frowned and pulled harder. Clean joined him, their boots digging into the dirt, their muscles straining, their confidence slipping with each second that passed without progress. The chain grew taut, the iron links groaning softly under pressure, but the giant stayed exactly where he stood. Unmoved, unshaken, as if the earth itself held him in place. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a low wave of disbelief, because this wasn't how it was supposed to work. Men always moved, they always yielded, they always broke. But this man did neither. Monroe stepped forward again, anger rising now, embarrassment burning behind his eyes. He grabbed the chain himself and pulled with all his strength. His jaw clenched, his breath sharp, his pride at stake, and still nothing happened. The giant's body didn't shift even the width of a finger. Monroe felt something cold crawl into his chest. Something he hadn't felt since he was a boy standing alone in the dark. The feeling of being small. He released the chain, stepping back abruptly, pretending he had only been testing it, pretending this was normal. But everyone watching knew it wasn't normal. Everyone watching understood they were witnessing something impossible. Into that silence stepped Thomas Whitaker again, his heavy boots slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on the giant with a mixture of fascination and calculation. Because Whitaker saw not just a problem, but an opportunity. He saw strength unlike anything he had ever owned, strength that could transform his plantation, strength that could increase his profits beyond imagination. He spoke calmly, his voice steady, masking the tension beneath it. "Bring the wagon." His order was obeyed without question because Whitaker was rich, and rich men shaped reality to fit their will. Soon the wagon was brought forward, a reinforced transport cart used for moving the strongest field hands, its wooden frame thick, its wheels solid, its chains newly forged. Monroe and the others approached the giant again, more cautious now, more aware of the unknown standing before them. They fastened additional chains around his wrists, his ankles, his waist, each lock snapping shut with forced confidence, and still the giant did nothing, offered nothing. "Secure," Whitaker said. He gestured toward the wagon. "Move him." Monroe hesitated just for a moment before taking hold of the chain and pulling toward the wagon. The others joined him, pulling harder now, determined to prove control, determined to erase the humiliation of moments before. For a long second, nothing happened. Then something did happen, something subtle, something terrible. The chain didn't move forward. Instead, the wagon moved backward, its wheels scraping across the dirt, pulled toward the giant by the force of their effort. Pike stumbled, losing his balance, clean cursed under his breath. The crowd gasped openly now, because they understood what they were seeing. The giant wasn't resisting, he wasn't fighting. And yet, he was stronger than the combined force of the men and the wagon itself. Whitaker's calm expression cracked just slightly, just enough to reveal the truth he didn't want to accept. This wasn't a normal man. This wasn't a simple purchase. This was something that couldn't be measured, couldn't be predicted, couldn't be safely owned. For the first time since he built his fortune, Thomas Whitaker felt doubt. And doubt was a dangerous thing for a man whose power depended entirely on certainty. He stepped closer to the giant, close enough to see the fine details of his face. The small scars along his jaw, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. The evidence of a life lived long before this moment, a life no document recorded. Whitaker spoke quietly, almost to himself. "What are you?" The giant looked down at him, not with anger, not with submission, but with something far more unsettling: recognition. As if he understood everything, as if he had always understood, as if he had been waiting for this moment long before any of them were born. The silence that followed was heavier than iron, heavier than chains, heavier than the weight of history itself, because in that moment every man present felt it. The fragile illusion of control, the lie at the heart of the market, the truth they could not speak. That power built on ownership could crumble in the presence of something that refused to be owned. None of them yet understood how far that truth would go, or how much it would cost them, or how impossible it would become to sell the giant slave who would not move. By midday, the story of the giant had spread beyond the market and into the streets of New Orleans, carried by whispers that moved faster than wagons, faster than reason. Men who had witnessed his stillness couldn't stop speaking of it, and men who hadn't witnessed it couldn't stop imagining it. Imagination always made things larger, darker, more dangerous, until truth and fear became the same thing. Standing at the center of that growing storm of rumor was the giant himself, still bound in iron, still silent, still watching, as if time itself had no claim over him. The traders, men who had spent their lives reducing human beings to objects, now found themselves uncertain how to even describe him. Because every word they used felt too small, too weak, too dishonest. Edmund Briggs stood near the wagon, wiping sweat from his neck. The heat alone didn't explain his discomfort. Because deep inside him, something older than reason was stirring, something that remembered stories told in childhood about men who were not meant to be owned. He turned to Silas Monroe and spoke in a lower voice than usual, asking where exactly the giant had come from. Monroe answered with the same uncertainty as before, saying only that the shipment had arrived from Richmond, Virginia, in the late days of 1847, carried on the cargo vessel named the Mercy, a name that now felt like mockery because Mercy had never lived on that ship. Monroe explained that he had personally overseen the unloading of every enslaved person on board, men, women, and children, all of them weak from the journey, all of them marked by hunger and fear, except for one, except for the giant, who had stepped off the ship under his own power, who had not stumbled, who had not looked down, who had not begged. Monroe admitted something he hadn't told anyone before, something he had kept hidden even from himself, that when the giant's bare feet touched the dock, the other enslaved men had moved away from him. Not out of resentment, but out of something closer to reverence, as if they recognized in him something beyond their shared suffering. Briggs listened carefully, because traders survived by understanding value, and value wasn't always visible. Sometimes value lived in mystery, in fear, in the unknown. And yet mystery also carried risk, and risk could destroy a man faster than poverty. As Briggs watched the giant, now unmoving despite the iron that bound him, he realized he was looking at a form of risk no ledger could calculate. Nearby, Thomas Whitaker stood in silence, his mind turning through possibilities. Whitaker had built his wealth on certainty, on the predictable conversion of human labor into sugar and sugar into gold. This man threatened that certainty, not through violence but through existence alone. Whitaker had seen strong men before, men who could lift impossible loads, men who could work from sunrise to darkness without collapse. But strength had always obeyed ownership. Strength had always bent beneath the whip. Yet something in the giant's stillness suggested a different kind of strength, a strength that didn't require movement to exist, a strength that lived in refusal without resistance. Whitaker stepped closer again, studying the giant's face, searching for weakness, searching for fear, searching for any sign that this man could be made into property. But he found none. Instead, he noticed details that unsettled him further. The faint marks across the giant's shoulders, scars not from whips, but from something older, something deeper. Scars that suggested survival through forces beyond the plantation system. Whitaker realized with growing unease that this man's story had not begun with slavery. This man had lived before chains, before ships, before markets, and that history, whatever it was, still lived inside him, untouched and unbroken. Around them, the market continued its nervous rhythm, buyers pretending confidence, traders pretending control, everyone pretending that nothing had changed. But beneath that performance, the truth waited, heavy and patient. Already attempts had been made to move the giant again, and already those attempts had failed. Now a new plan was forming, a plan born from desperation. Whitaker had decided he would not accept defeat. He would not allow this investment to escape him. He ordered additional handlers to prepare the reinforced transport frame, a structure of thick oak beams and layered iron designed for the most difficult human cargo. As the handlers worked, hammering metal, tightening bolts, avoiding the giant's gaze whenever possible, the giant remained still, conserving energy, observing, waiting. One handler, a younger man named Elias Carter, couldn't stop himself from staring. He had never seen a man like this, never felt this strange mixture of fear and curiosity. Carter found himself wondering something dangerous. What kind of life could create such a man? What kind of suffering could fail to break him? What kind of will could survive the machinery of slavery intact? Carter quickly pushed the thought away, because thoughts like that could destroy a man's place in this world. When the transport frame was finally ready, Whitaker gave the order to secure the giant within it. 6 handlers approached together, moving with forced coordination, fastening iron around wrists, ankles, and chest, anchoring each point to the wooden frame. Their hands shook despite their efforts to appear calm. When the final lock closed, they stepped back, breathing heavily, waiting, hoping. Whitaker nodded toward the wagon team, signaling them to begin. The horses strained forward, muscles tightening, hooves digging into the dirt, pulling against the weight behind them. For a moment it seemed to work. The frame creaked, the chains tightened, the wagon wheels turned slightly. Hope flickered in Whitaker's chest, fragile and desperate, but then the motion stopped, not gradually but completely, as if the world itself had decided no further movement would occur. The horses pulled harder, their bodies trembling with effort, foam forming at their mouths, their eyes wide with confusion and distress. But the frame didn't move again. Whitaker felt something inside him begin to crack, something deeper than pride, deeper than profit, something closer to belief itself, because he was witnessing a violation of the natural order he depended upon. The handlers shouted, striking the horses, forcing them to greater effort. But still the giant didn't move. He didn't resist. He didn't struggle, he didn't fight, he simply existed, and in that existence he defied them all. Carter, watching from the side, felt a cold realization settle into his bones. The realization that they were not failing to move the giant because of weakness, but because of something else entirely. Something no chain could address, something no system could command. For the first time since the market had opened that morning, Carter understood the truth no one wanted to speak. That this man might never be transported anywhere, that he might remain exactly where he stood, not through force, but through will alone. That possibility frightened him more than any act of violence ever could. Because violence could be answered, violence could be punished. But this silent, immovable presence offered no target, no leverage, no path to control as the sun began its slow descent toward evening, casting longer shadows across the yard. Those shadows seemed to gather around the giant, merging with him, making him appear even larger, even more permanent. One by one, the men who had tried to move him stepped back, their confidence exhausted, their certainty broken. The market, which had always been a place of noise and motion, fell into a strange and unnatural quiet, because everyone present understood they were witnessing the beginning of something none of them had been prepared to face. The existence of a man who could not be moved, and whose story had only just begun. The evening settled over New Orleans like a heavy blanket, the sky turning a bruised purple as the market emptied, except for those still drawn to the impossibility standing before them. Stories of the giant had already traveled faster than footsteps, faster than the wind, whispered through alleyways, across docks, into homes where men and women paused in their daily lives to imagine the sight of him. Imagination alone made him grow larger, more impossible, more terrifying, and yet he remained silent, unmoving, a monolith of muscle and will that refused to bend to the ordinary rules of men. As the shadows lengthened across the dirt, they clung to him, merging with his enormous form. The whispers began again, this time not just among traders and buyers, but among the enslaved men and women who had seen him. They sensed in him something familiar, something that spoke to a deeper, darker knowledge of the world, a knowledge of survival that had nothing to do with chains or whips or the false authority of men. One of the older slaves, a woman named Martha Bell, whose hands were worn from decades of labor in cotton fields, murmured to a younger man beside her that he was like the men of the old stories, men whose strength came not from iron or fear, but from something they carried inside them. The young man shivered, because even in the dim light he could see that she was right. There was something about the giant that made the air itself feel different, heavier, charged, as if nature recognized his presence and paused to respect it. Far across the yard, Whitaker, still furious but calculating, paced slowly in his heavy boots, the weight of his fortune pressing down on him. He knew that failure to secure this man, to bend him, to move him to his plantation, would not just cost money, it would cost reputation, authority, and pride, things Whitaker valued more than life itself. He turned to Briggs and Monroe, his voice low but sharp, commanding them to bring forward ideas, strategies, anything to convince this man to move. Briggs spoke first, his tone careful, measured, because he too felt the strange weight in the yard, the invisible pressure of the impossible man before them. He suggested breaking him down slowly, testing his patience, showing dominance through hours, even days of controlled force. Whitaker nodded, though unease flickered in his eyes, because even the idea of forcing him for days seemed insufficient, almost laughable, almost impossible. And so the plan began, a plan born from desperation and human arrogance to try every method known to traders, to push and pull, to coax and threaten, to appeal to fear, hunger, and pain, knowing that men like the giant usually broke under such circumstances, and yet every test they attempted failed. Every threat fell flat, every insult, every promise of punishment, every whisper of hope, all of it disappeared against the unyielding presence of the man. Soon the handlers began to speak among themselves, nervously in low tones, questioning whether he was even human in the sense they understood. One young man, Carter, who had been tasked with watching the giant's feet during the first failed attempt to move him, finally voiced the unthinkable aloud, asking if perhaps the stories were true. Stories whispered among enslaved people, stories of men who were born too large for chains, men whose strength and will existed in a dimension outside the ordinary world, men whose bodies carried the memory of old powers, powers no trader could calculate or control. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and pungent, because no one dared disagree, yet no one could confirm. The giant continued to stand unmoved, his breath steady, his eyes calm. The night deepened around him, carrying with it the weight of fear, awe, and uncertainty. Because every man and woman present understood at some level they could not name that the laws, the chains, the whip, the contracts, all the machinery of human ownership were meaningless here, utterly meaningless in the presence of a man whose body alone refused to obey, whose will alone resisted control, whose very existence unsettled the natural order. Briggs finally approached Whitaker, speaking quietly but firmly, suggesting that perhaps the man came from the forests of Virginia, from deep riverside plantations far from the eyes of traders, where some enslaved people were known to grow larger, stronger, more mysterious, men whose size made them difficult to sell, men who carried themselves with the dignity of survival. Whitaker frowned, though he didn't show it openly. While he had seen tall men, strong men, terrifying men, he had never seen one that moved like a shadow of power yet remained perfectly still, a man who seemed born to be unbroken. As he considered the words, he noticed subtle details he hadn't before, the way the giant's chest rose and fell, slow and measured, almost ceremonial, the scars along his arms that spoke of previous violence but blows that might have shattered an ordinary man, yet left him untouched, as if the blows themselves had recognized their futility. Whitaker began to wonder, against every rational thought he had ever held, whether this man's strength was physical alone, or if something deeper sustained him. Some kind of inner force, some kind of history, some kind of knowledge no ledger could record. While Whitaker debated in his mind, the enslaved onlookers continued to murmur, their voices low, curious, fearful, admiring. They sensed that the giant's power belonged not to Whitaker or Briggs or Monroe or any trader. It belonged to him alone, a power rooted in survival, endurance, and mystery. As the hours passed, the market itself seemed to bend around him. The usual chaos of shouting, bargaining, and movement slowed. Whispers replaced commands, hesitant footsteps replaced confident strides, because even the air around him carried weight, a pressure born from an impossibility. One older trader, who had seen more than any other present, whispered to no one in particular that he had never seen a man like this in his 40 years in the trade. The giant reminded him of the men from old plantations, where the woods ran wild, where slaves had sometimes disappeared for months and returned with knowledge, strength, and size no one could explain. The memory of those stories sent a chill across the yard, because even seasoned traders knew that some men, some human beings, carried secrets no chain could break. Whitaker, listening carefully, realized that he was trapped in a confrontation he had not anticipated. The market, the rules, the horses, the reinforced wagons, even the strongest men, all were useless in this scenario. And yet he could not retreat, because retreat would mean humiliation, and humiliation could destroy the carefully built empire of a plantation owner. So he remained, pacing slowly, calculating possibilities, each one darker than the last, imagining attempts to starve the giant into submission, imagining the use of the whip, imagining splitting the group to find leverage, imagining threats of sale, imagining every cruel possibility known to man. And none worked, none could work, because the giant's existence operated on a different plane, beyond ordinary punishment, beyond ordinary obedience, beyond ordinary fear. As the sky darkened completely, casting black shadows over the dirt and the wooden fence posts, a realization spread among everyone present, subtle at first, then undeniable, that this man had survived more than chains, more than whips, more than the market itself, and he would survive again. In that realization grew fascination, terror, and respect, because to exist where no one could control you was to claim a power few had ever seen. Carter, standing slightly apart, couldn't stop thinking about the stories of the forests and the river plantations. Stories whispered in the dead of night, stories of men who could not be moved, men whose labor was valuable but whose existence defied capture, men whose presence changed the energy of a place simply by being. The giant standing there, silent, massive, immovable, embodied all of that history and more, carrying with him the unspoken knowledge of a life beyond calculation, beyond ownership. A life that had begun before the chains arrived and would likely continue after. The weight of that knowledge settled on the shoulders of every man who tried to touch him, every man who attempted to move him, every man who had counted on reason, on force, on money to dictate reality. They felt it pressing down, a heaviness they could not shake. As midnight approached, the lanterns flickering around the yard cast dancing shadows across the giant's body, making him appear taller, darker, more eternal than ever. The crowd that had gathered slowly thinned, leaving only the most invested, the most curious, the most desperate, because no one wanted to leave entirely. No one wanted to miss what might happen next, the first time a man had ever truly resisted the machinery of human commerce with nothing but sheer existence. Whitaker finally stood still, considering what the next day might bring, considering whether the giant could ever be transported at all, considering whether he was not merely a slave to be sold, but a force of history, a living impossibility. The giant, eyes calm, breath steady, remained at the center of that impossible tension, as though he alone understood the unfolding story of the market, of men, of chains, of fear. The night deepened around him, thick and patient, and the world seemed to wait for what would happen next. The night gave way slowly to the pale gray light of early morning. The mist hung over the docks and streets of New Orleans like a shroud, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The giant remained at the center of the yard, bound in iron, yet unmoved, silent, yet commanding attention in a way no man could ignore, because in that silence lay a power older than chains, older than the whip, older than the market itself. A power born from survival and endurance, and perhaps something no one living had the right to name. As the first traders began to arrive for the morning's work, whispers spread among them like wildfire. Stories of the man who could not be sold, stories of the impossibility standing quietly in the corner, stories that grew taller with each telling until the giant was no longer just a man. He was a legend, a question posed to the universe, a challenge no one dared answer. Whitaker arrived early, his heavy boots echoing across the dirt, his eyes fixed on the unmoving figure, as if searching for cracks, weaknesses, flaws, anything that could be exploited. Briggs and Monroe followed, muttering nervously among themselves because even they, experienced men of commerce and cruelty, felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down, pressing heavier than any cargo they had ever transported. The handlers assembled, their faces pale, their hands trembling slightly despite their attempts at confidence. They knew the first day had been a failure. The attempts to move the giant had failed. The chains had failed. The reinforced frame had failed. Now they faced a second day with the same impossibility, yet retreat was impossible. Failure was not an option. Whitaker's pride and fortune demanded action, and so the plan began anew. This time more calculated, more deliberate, more desperate, because they could not allow a single man to defy them, not when he represented profit, authority, and control. And yet the giant did not act, did not resist, did not acknowledge the schemes around him. He simply existed, a mountain of muscle and stillness that absorbed every effort and returned none. Briggs spoke first, whispering to Monroe, suggesting they try division, to isolate him, to bring him away from the crowd, to remove any energy that fed him. Whitaker nodded slowly, considering the idea. If the giant's presence alone strengthened him, then separation might weaken him. The handlers moved, attempting to lure him toward a smaller space, toward a narrow alley behind the market, toward a temporary pen, anything to gain leverage, anything to bend him to ordinary will. The giant followed with deliberate calm, not resisting, not cooperating, simply moving under his own terms, his pace measured, his gaze steady. Every step he took seemed to reverberate through the earth beneath, as if the soil itself acknowledged the weight he carried. When they reached the narrow enclosure, the handlers tried again, fastening chains and locks, tightening iron around wrists, ankles, and waist, pressing every point of contact they could, and still the giant did not yield. Still he did not struggle. Still he remained exactly as he chose to be. Whitaker, watching from the edge of the pen, felt something he had never felt before. The raw frustration of human impotence, the impossibility of forcing reality to bend to will. He cursed under his breath, muttering that no man should be allowed to survive in defiance of authority. No man should exist outside the rules of commerce, and yet the giant continued to stand, calm, steady, unmoved. As the hours passed, Whitaker and the traders began to notice subtle signs that this man was more than physical strength. The power he carried was deeper, older. It resided in the precision of his patience, the certainty of his endurance, the knowledge that he alone determined his actions, and no chain, no whip, no threat, no plan could alter that. The market grew quiet because even the most hardened men of commerce could sense the unnatural weight in the air, the unnatural power radiating from one human body. A power that defied calculation, a power that unsettled every assumption, every plan, every sense of control. The enslaved men and women present watched with mixed fear and awe because they recognized something familiar, something their elders had whispered of in secret, men born outside ordinary bounds. Men whose size and strength were impossible, men whose presence alone commanded respect. The stories from Virginia, the distant plantations along the rivers, where men had been known to grow larger than ordinary, where they had been rumored to survive storms, attacks, and punishments that would have killed others, suddenly gained meaning because here he was, proof that the old tales were more than legend. Proof that human force could exist beyond ordinary measurement. Briggs whispered to Monroe that if they could not move him, they could at least learn. They could study him, document him, understand what they faced. Monroe nodded, though unease lingered, because understanding was useless if power could not be controlled. Whitaker, not willing to accept hesitation, ordered the construction of a new device, something stronger, heavier, more reinforced than anything they had ever used. A cage-like frame of iron and oak designed to completely immobilize a man, to hold him in place no matter the weight of muscle, no matter the force of will. As the carpenters hammered, as the blacksmiths forged, as the chains rattled, the giant remained silent, calm, and perfectly aware, observing every movement, every glance, every calculation, as if he could see the outcome of every plan before it was even conceived. When the frame was finally completed, monstrous in size, capable of containing what should have been impossible, the handlers approached, fastening chains and locks, attaching every restraint with care and precision. And still, despite the weight and ingenuity, despite the combined effort of 6 men pushing and pulling, the giant did not move, did not resist, did not yield. Whitaker's face darkened, because he realized that even his most clever invention, the strongest mechanical device he could imagine, was powerless here. Powerless against patience, against will, against the certainty that resided in the giant alone. The first whispers began among the traders, tentative at first, questioning whether he was human, whether he had survived some curse, whether he carried inside him the memory of something older, something the market could not understand, something beyond chains, beyond ownership, beyond profit. Carter, unable to resist, spoke aloud what others had only dared think, that perhaps this man's strength was not physical alone, perhaps the secret of survival, the secret of resistance, the secret that made him impossible to transport, resided in something no one could see, some inner force, some unbreakable resolve, some history that had never been recorded. The words hung in the air, heavier than iron, because they dared to suggest that all the rules Whitaker had relied upon were irrelevant, meaningless in the presence of a man whose very existence defied them. As the sun rose higher, painting the city in pale light, the market became a place of study, observation, and fear. The giant refused to play by any ordinary rule. Every attempt to understand him only deepened the mystery, revealing subtle details, scars on his body that suggested previous battles, muscle formations unlike any ordinary man, eyes that seemed to calculate and remember, skin that bore the marks of past survival, hands capable of crushing bone yet moved with deliberate restraint. His presence alone created tension, a quiet terror in every observer, because they realized that no chain, no whip, no plan, no force could guarantee control, that in this man's existence lay a power that could undo the assumptions of every trader, every owner, every man who thought he could bend others to his will. Whitaker, pacing slowly, felt the first flicker of fear, a new sensation for a man who had dealt in the suffering of others his entire life. Because the giant was not just resistance, not just strength, he was impossibility made flesh, the living embodiment of a truth that no one in the yard wanted to name, that some men could not be owned, that some men existed outside calculation, that the market itself, all its rules, all its chains, all its authority, was meaningless here. As the day wore on, the giant remained calm, silent, patient, watching, aware of every eye, every movement, every calculation, while the world around him tried in vain to bend reality to its will. The whispers continued, growing louder, spreading beyond the yard, because humans are storytellers, and the impossible demands stories. Soon the giant was no longer just a man. He was legend, a caution, a question, a shadow that no trader could fully comprehend. The market, the chains, the reinforced wagons, the men who had planned to transport him. All of it became irrelevant because the giant's presence alone commanded respect, commanded fear, commanded attention in a way that no man could resist. Carter, standing slightly apart, realized with a chill that the story was not just about movement, about transport, about obedience. The story was about power, about survival, about a life lived beyond ordinary rules. And the giant, colossal, massive, unbroken, immovable, remained at the center of it all, the impossible eternal force that refused to yield. The giant's story did not begin at the New Orleans market, nor on the vessel that carried him from Virginia, nor even on the plantations that had failed to control him. His life stretched back into shadows that few living souls had witnessed, a life carved in mystery and survival, in riverside forests, deep swamps, and abandoned lands where enslaved people sometimes vanished for months and returned with strength no ledger could record. Those who had heard the tales whispered that he was born in the winter of 1825, a child of extraordinary size even among the enslaved. His mother was a woman whose own strength had kept her alive in the harshest conditions of northern Virginia. His father was rumored to be a man of incredible power, the kind whose presence bent others' will simply by existing, though no official record acknowledged such a man, because the law and commerce refused to admit the possibility of humans beyond measure. From the earliest days, the child grew faster than the others, his limbs long and thick, his chest broadening, with a speed that frightened overseers. And yet he walked with patience, with awareness, with a deliberate control over his own body, learning early that brute force alone was not survival, that timing, observation, and self-possession could outmatch fear, violence, and chains. By the age of 15, he was already larger than men twice his age, carrying scars from lashes, bites, and strikes that would have felled anyone else. And yet he endured, standing taller, moving with purpose, his eyes calm, knowing, observing. Always aware, the elders of the enslaved community watched him in silence, whispering that this boy carried a gift, a legacy, a memory of strength unbroken, that he could not be owned fully, because some part of him belonged to the earth itself, to the rivers, to the forests, to forces older than the plantations themselves. Stories grew around him, stories told in the hush of night, that when he entered the woods, he moved like a shadow of the wind, bending branches without effort, breaking paths where none had existed, finding food and water where others saw only dead land. In every test, every whip, every labor, he absorbed pain without letting it diminish him, transforming suffering into endurance, into presence, into something deeper. When he was 17, rumors reached him that traders were approaching, seeking the strongest among the enslaved for sale. He walked deliberately away from his small settlement along the river, moving silently into the forests that bordered the plantations, places where others feared to go, places where the earth itself seemed to recognize him. There he survived in ways that no human had survived before, constructing shelters from mud and reeds, fishing with skill unmatched, hunting with patience and precision, avoiding capture for months. When he was finally found by a trader in the early months of 1847, he was already a man grown, massive, unbroken, aware of every movement, every trap, every threat. The trader who first tried to subdue him noted the impossibility immediately. The way the giant's body carried weight and will in perfect balance, the way his eyes revealed nothing yet calculated everything. Every attempt to move him failed. Every rope snapped, every chain bent, every strategy proved useless because the giant did not resist in anger. He did not struggle, he did not fight. He simply existed, and that existence alone was stronger than the iron. Stronger than the market, stronger than every man who sought to own him. As he arrived at New Orleans, carried under the supervision of traders who had never faced such a force, the crowd that gathered did not fully understand what they were witnessing. because even seasoned men of commerce and cruelty had never confronted a man whose very being made the rules meaningless. Whitaker, watching, realized that if he could not move the giant today, he would be forced to invent new strategies, new devices, new methods of control that no one had ever imagined. He ordered chains of heavier iron, frames of reinforced oak. Every attempt failed. The giant remained calm, unbroken, unyielding. The whispers among the enslaved men and women grew, whispers of respect, of fear, of awe. Stories passed from one to another in the dark corners of the yard, that this man carried the strength of survival itself, the knowledge that no one could take what belonged to him internally, that no chain could measure the power of a life lived in defiance of oppression. As the sun climbed higher, the giant was placed in every device the traders could devise, every frame, every cart, every mechanism of restraint. Each one failed, bending, breaking, or refusing to contain him. The market grew silent again, because the reality of his power pressed upon every man and woman. Heavy, impossible, undeniable, Carter, standing to the side, couldn't stop thinking about the stories from the forests of Virginia. Stories that had seemed like myth, stories of men who could not be sold, who survived beyond ordinary law, beyond human cruelty. He realized with a chill that he was witnessing proof, and that proof was dangerous because it revealed how fragile the assumptions of control truly were, how vulnerable men like Whitaker and Briggs really were. As the afternoon passed, the giant was observed in every movement, every breath, every subtle adjustment of his posture, because even in stillness there was power, a steady rhythm of endurance that could not be disrupted, a pulse that belonged to himself alone. Every attempt to provoke anger, to provoke submission failed because his mind was calm, patient, precise. Every calculation the traders made, every strategy, every shove, every shout was anticipated in subtle ways. In ways they could not name, in ways that made them hesitate, made them question themselves, made them fear that ordinary rules of human behavior did not apply here. As the day wore on, the stories began to spread beyond the yard. Across the city, carried by those who had seen him, those who had whispered to each other in awe and fear, until the giant was no longer just a man in a market. He was a story, a question, a force, a presence that haunted the imagination of every observer. Whitaker, pacing again, felt the weight of history pressing on him, because he realized that control, profit, and authority could not capture this man, that his presence alone unsettled every plan, every calculation, every belief in ownership. The giant, calm, silent, massive, immovable, observed the motions of every man around him, understanding perhaps the absurdity of the effort, understanding the limits of human will, understanding that no chain, no frame, no cart, no whip could bend what had been forged over decades of survival in forests, swamps, and river plantations. In that understanding lay a subtle terror for all who watched, because they realized that to confront the impossible, to confront the unbroken, to confront a man whose life defied measurement, was to confront the fragility of their own assumptions. As night returned, casting shadows over the yard, over the reinforced frames, over the exhausted handlers, the giant remained the same, calm, silent, a massive presence at the center of fear, awe, and legend. Those who had been forced to study him, to attempt control, to imagine ways to subdue him, realized that this man carried in his body and in his will a history that no ledger recorded, a history of survival, endurance, and impossibility that could not be bought, could not be sold, and could never be contained. As the stars appeared above New Orleans, distant and cold, the giant's shadow stretched across the dirt, across the market, across every expectation of men who thought themselves masters of human life. The realization sank in heavier than iron. This man, massive, unbroken, patient, silent, had already survived more than chains, more than whips, more than markets, more than men, and that survival alone made him eternal in the memory of every witness. The legend of the giant slave who could not be sold grew, spreading silently, inevitably in whispers, in awe, in fear, in the understanding that some human lives, some human wills cannot be measured, cannot be controlled, cannot be owned. That the world as structured by men is fragile in the presence of those who refuse to bend. The giant remained there, calm, silent, immovable, timeless, a force of history, endurance, and impossibility that none could claim. None could move, none could diminish. The dawn that followed the longest night over New Orleans brought with it a strange stillness, a quiet that hung over the market yard like a heavy curtain. Even the wind seemed to pause, sensing the weight of what could not be moved, what could not be broken, what refused to yield. The giant remained at the center of that yard, bound in chains, yet unmoved, silent, yet commanding attention in a way no man had ever encountered, because he had survived not just the market, not just the voyage from Virginia, not just the cruel hands of plantation owners, but decades of life lived outside ordinary measure. Life carved in the forests along the James River, life carried in swamps, rivers, and hidden clearings where the earth itself seemed to recognize his presence and support him. The whispers among the traders who had attempted every method known to man to subdue him grew into full conversations, low murmurs filled with fear, awe, and disbelief, because the giant's calm defiance exposed the fragility of every assumption they had held about control, about human obedience, about the rules that bound people into commodities. Whitaker, pacing along the edge of the yard, felt an unfamiliar tension coil in his chest, a mixture of frustration and fascination. Here was a man whose power was not merely physical, whose strength was not measured by muscle alone, whose will and presence had already altered the expectations of everyone watching. As he considered new strategies, new devices, new forms of control, he realized that each attempt risked humiliation, injury, and perhaps worse, the realization that some lives could not be owned, some wills could not bend, some bodies could not be moved. That realization was dangerous for a man whose fortune, reputation, and pride were intertwined with certainty, for a man who had never known limits to his power. For a man who had relied on fear, iron, and contracts to command obedience, the giant, standing quietly yet aware, observed every movement of the humans around him, his eyes calm, calculating, absorbing the energy and tension in the yard, because his life had taught him that observation, patience, and timing were more effective than struggle. He had survived every danger the world had sent, not through impulse, not through rage, but through measured endurance. The elders of the enslaved community had watched him as a boy, whispering in the shadows of cabins and riverbanks, that he carried the strength of survival itself, that he embodied knowledge no ledger recorded, knowledge of rivers, forests, storms, hunters, and predators, knowledge of endurance, knowledge of timing, knowledge of when to act and when to remain still. That knowledge had carried him to this moment, unmoved, unbroken, untouchable by ordinary means. As the morning wore on, the reinforced frame, the chains, the horses, the handlers, every device the traders had imagined was brought out again, tested, observed. Each time they failed, bending, snapping, resisting, or simply being ignored by the giant, because he did not resist in anger. He did not resist in fear. He resisted by existence alone. That resistance carried its own force, a force that shifted the energy of the yard, a force that unsettled every man who had counted on control as the hours stretched. Whispers grew into stories, stories of impossible strength, stories of men born outside ordinary bounds, stories of lives unbroken by punishment or oppression, stories that traveled quietly beyond the market, reaching distant plantations, reaching enslaved people who recognized truth in the legend, because they too understood the value of a life that could not be owned, a life that could not be measured, a life that commanded respect simply by surviving and existing. Carter, observing closely, shivered at the realization that the giant's power was not just physical, it was psychological, it was historical, it was existential. Because he had endured decades in forests, rivers, and plantations, learning, observing, surviving. Now he existed in a place where ordinary rules applied, yet they meant nothing to him. The knowledge of survival, endurance, and impossibility radiated from him like heat from stone, pressing upon everyone nearby, altering perception, bending confidence, creating unease. Whitaker, refusing to show doubt, attempted yet another plan, one that required coordination, force, and ingenuity. He brought in men to dig trenches, to anchor chains in deeper iron, to create obstacles meant to break his will or at least tire him. And still the giant did not move, did not falter, did not yield, because he understood that motion was optional, that struggle was unnecessary, that the world could exert force, but it could not command essence. As the sun reached its zenith, illuminating the sweat and fear of every trader, The calm presence of the giant became almost unbearable. The contrast between ordinary human effort and impossible human endurance was undeniable. Whispers began of his origin. Stories circulating that he had been born in the winter of 1825, raised along the James River, surviving attacks, storms. Hunters, overseers, carrying scars that told a life of endurance, of defiance, of survival. Knowledge passed through generations of men and women who had survived beyond measure. Those stories made the giant larger in imagination. Larger in significance, larger than mere flesh, larger than chains, larger than any market. As the afternoon waned, the reinforced frames, carts, and devices had been tried, tested, and failed repeatedly, bending under effort, cracking under tension, or simply being ignored by the calm, massive, patient presence. Whitaker, forced to acknowledge reality, began to understand that ordinary methods were irrelevant, that human strength, commerce, and cruelty were insufficient to subdue this man. As the shadows lengthened, stretching across the yard and merging with the giant's form, even the sunlight seemed to recognize his weight in history, casting long, dark shapes that mirrored his massive presence. The traders, exhausted and unsettled, whispered among themselves, speculating that the giant's strength was born not just of muscle, but of history, of survival, of something older than the market, something ancestral, something beyond calculation. As dusk approached, the air itself seemed to hold its breath, the world quieting, as if acknowledging that a life had arrived at a state no ordinary force could alter. The giant, standing, breathing, watching, remained the center of every thought, every calculation, every story, every fear. The enslaved observers too felt something ancient, something deep, a recognition that this man carried within him the legacy of survival, endurance, and mystery. In that recognition lay respect, awe, and something close to fear, because power beyond measure commands such reactions. Carter, standing to the side, realized that the story of this man would never be forgotten. The legend was already spreading. Every witness would carry it forward. The giant had become more than flesh, more than muscle, more than chains, more than market, more than life itself. He had become the embodiment of resistance, impossibility, and history. As night finally fell, casting black shadows over the exhausted yard, over the broken devices, over the trembling handlers, over Whitaker's forced composure, the giant remained calm, silent, immovable, eternal, the living impossibility, the unbroken, the unknowable. Those who had seen him knew that his story had only just begun, that his presence alone would ripple through generations, whispered among those who had suffered, observed by those who sought control, remembered by those who understood that some human lives cannot be claimed, some wills cannot bend, some existences defy everything the world insists upon. The giant, massive, patient, silent, remained at the center of it all, a force of endurance, legend, and the eternal proof that some men, some lives, some wills can be moved, cannot be sold, and cannot be owned. The giant stood as the last light of day faded over New Orleans, his immense form casting shadows that stretched long across the worn dirt of the market, a figure of quiet power that no chain, no frame, no whip, no plan could ever bend, move, or contain. Those who had watched him, from the traders who had attempted every possible method of subjugation to the enslaved men and women who observed from the edges of the yard, understood at last that he was more than flesh, more than muscle, more than size. He was the living embodiment of survival, patience, and defiance, a man whose life had been forged through decades of hardship in forests, swamps, and river plantations far from the eyes of those who sought to own him. A man who had endured storms, hunters, overseers, and cruelty that would have destroyed ordinary men, yet emerged unbroken, calm, precise, aware, and completely untouchable. In that presence lay a lesson: no ledger, no market, no master could record that some human lives, some wills, some existences cannot be measured, cannot be owned, cannot be broken. As the shadows merged with his enormous body, the air itself seemed to bend to the weight of his existence, commanding respect, awe, and fear from every observer, whispering the truth that the systems of control, the machinery of commerce, and the instruments of cruelty were powerless against the certainty, endurance, and patience carried within a single human life. The giant's story, passed from whispered word to whispered word, began to grow beyond the market, beyond New Orleans, traveling along rivers, plantations, and hidden communities, reaching ears that recognize the truth in it, that some men survive and resist in ways the world cannot comprehend. Those who had tried to move him realized with a heavy understanding that every attempt had failed, not due to chance or weakness, but because they had confronted something beyond ordinary measure, a man whose life, experience, and will were entirely his own. As night settled completely over the city, lanterns casting flickering light across the exhausted yard, the giant remained massive, calm, unmoving, eternal, a testament to the power of survival, endurance, and human will. Those who witnessed him knew that his legend would live forever, a story of impossibility, defiance, and freedom that could not be erased, that no chain could touch, and that no man could claim. And so the tale of the giant slave comes to its close, but his presence remains a reminder that human life can carry within its strength no master can understand, that some wills will always resist control, that some existences will endure unbroken forever. If this story has moved you, if it has made you pause and reflect on the lives that history often forgets, then do not let it end here. Share it with others, remember it, honor it, and subscribe to Dictarine of Darkness, because there are more untold stories waiting to be revealed. More voices from the past that demand to be heard, more truths that the world should never forget. Like the story of the giant who could not be sold, the unbroken, the impossible, whose life remains a testament to endurance, resistance, and the eternal power of human will. By liking, subscribing, and sharing this story, you become part of preserving the memory of those who survived, who resisted, and who remind us all that freedom, strength, and resilience cannot be measured, cannot be owned, and cannot be defeated.